Some of these lessons that we learn are taught to us at a tender young age where the brain is starting to formulate neurologically, a tender young age where we haven't even learned to speak yet. We haven't formulated an identity yet, and yet those lessons are already starting to be instilled in us, embedded in us, hardwired in us at that age, and we will carry those lessons into adulthood, lessons that don't always serve us. Some households, kids are taught not to identify or express certain emotions, maybe because the parents don't know how to identify and express those emotions. So if they don't have it, they can't give it. If they don't have it, they can't teach it. And if they can't teach it, then the kids can't learn it. Or if it's an abusive or neglectful home, then kids learn that it's dangerous for them to identify or express certain emotions entirely. So if they don't express it, then they learn to suppress it. Quit crying or I'll give you something to cry about. Don't wear your emotions on your sleeve. Fear is seen as a sign of weakness. And yet those same caregivers may model other emotions such as anger. But anger is a secondary emotion. If you follow it down the rabbit hole, you find sadness and fear as primary emotions. So usually when you see someone who's angry, oftentimes they're sad or afraid. They may not know that, but those are the primary emotions, and anger is what bubbles to the surface. Those primary emotions are who we are. It's a part of who we are. And when we disconnect from those emotions, we're disconnecting from a part of who we are at our core. And it's not just the households, it's also certain neighborhoods, certain peer groups, certain societies, certain cultures. It becomes a cultural norm in some places for kids to not identify or express certain emotions. I remember where I grew up, I was taught to have a mentality, I don't give a fuck mentality. I don't give a fuck what people think about me mentality. And it was taught to me by a bunch of people who cared entirely too much about what other people thought about them. And in that same place, I always thought it was ironic that I was also taught to keep it real. And I thought that was ironic because it was anything but real, but authentic. It wasn't genuine. We wore a mask. It was a false bravado, an ego. We were just projecting an image of what we thought was powerful, confident. But really, if we took the mask off, we would have been able to say, I'm afraid, I'm scared. And we would have been met with other people who said, I'm also scared and I'm also afraid. But it wasn't safe to do that in that environment. So you can't fault people for doing what they needed to do to survive. They needed to project that image. They needed to disconnect. It was a survival mechanism. But what we once did when we were younger in order to survive, at some point, hopefully we get to a place where we recognize that although that once served me, it's no longer advantageous for me to be able to process my emotions like that. That I have to cultivate emotional intelligence, emotional maturity. And in order to do that, I have to identify and express certain emotions. What I once saw as a weakness now becomes a strength. Alexithymia is defined as the inability to identify and express one's emotions. Alexithymia. You can't identify or express certain emotions. There's a particular type of alexithymia known as male normative alexithymia, which is the inability to identify and express certain emotions that society views as not masculine, such as sadness and fear. So I can't identify with sadness or fear because that's not man enough. I'm too tough to do that. So you don't identify with that. You don't express that. That whole term, male normative alexithymia, implies that it only applies to men, males. But it's a misnomer because women can have it too. It should be called normative alexithymia. It's like we think that if we identify and express a primary emotion such as fear, which we need to survive, if we identify and express that we're just gonna tuck our tail between our legs, that we're gonna cower in the corner, that we're gonna become a victim, that life's just gonna beat us down, that if you say that, everything's gonna change. It's seen as such a sign of weakness, but really it's not. It's actually a sign of strength to be able to identify your emotions. It actually takes a whole lot of strength and courage to be able to take your mask off, to show vulnerability, to expose yourself to the world in all your true colors. This is what I'm experiencing on my journey, and it's okay for me to feel comfortable in my own skin and speak on that I don't need to disconnect from that I don't need to detach from that. You have to find your courage. Just because you feel fear doesn't mean that it's going to impede your functioning necessarily, as long as you have courage. Courage is defined as moving forward in the face of fear. There is no courage without fear. In order to be courageous, you have to identify and express your fear. The act in and of itself is courageous. And it's not just fear, it's also sadness. I had a client come into session and tell me, I can't stop crying, and I don't even know why. And I asked him, are you sad? And he looked at me like, with a sense of bewilderment. And I knew exactly why, because he was taught to not identify or express sadness, that was a sign of weakness, which is sad. A lot of us know that crying is a reflection of the emotion sadness. There's a lot of sad things in this world. You're gonna go through losses and tragedies. Things are gonna happen along the way that are gonna make you feel sad. I just had to put my dog Timber down, and I was on the floor at the vet crying. And when I left there, I had to give myself credit for being able to identify and express and cry. It took a lot of strength to be able to do that. Some of us are taught at that tender young age when our brains are formulating to not do that, and it's not safe to do that. And then we spend 30 years building these walls to protect ourselves, which maybe we needed to do. Then all of a sudden we're learning that the lesson is to bring those walls down, to open up, to identify, to unpack, to turn and face those emotions and turn and look them in the eye, sit with them, extract the lesson, find the purpose embedded in the pain, to identify and express those emotions. You spent 30 years building the wall, now you gotta bring the walls down. It can feel foreign, it can make you afraid. It's gonna take a lot of courage for you to do that. But you have to develop your ability to increase your emotional intelligence, your emotional maturity, to be authentic, to keep it real, to be able to identify and express your emotions, to hand select certain people that you feel safe identifying and expressing those certain emotions too. We're designed to connect, not disconnect. You shouldn't suppress, you should express. Timber approves this message.